Angeliki. Good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak about something that is not so frequently discussed among museum professionals, negotiations and power relations in the arts institutions. Museums themselves tend to be quite fixed constructions in the people's minds. Many visitors still perceive museums to be unapproachable and only representative of one voice, one viewpoint, one culture. The current definition of the museum by the International Council of Museums, ICOM, was formulated after minor additions in 2007. From 2007 until today, there have been significant social changes worldwide that create new needs. In 2016, ICOM decided to rework, supplement, and revise the current definition. However, after much discussion and consultation, no agreement on a new definition was reached at the General Assembly held in Kyoto in 2019. So the postponement of the vote and the return to the issue for discussion in subsequent meetings was decided by a large majority. The ICOM Executive Board set up a new special committee which defined from the outset the new procedure and the way in which ICOM members participate in the investigation of the whole issue, so that the new definition that will be proposed has the greatest possible acceptance. The process concerning the redefinition of the museum itself is quite indicative of the important ethical questions arising for museums, in much the same way that the democratization of democracy has been crucial to the discourse of radical democracy. Although the function of the museum is situated in the domain of public institutions, a museum is neither the street nor the parliament. It is, however, a deeply political space. Can we persist by claiming public and democratic spaces under the current social and economic conditions? Museums ethics is not a universal set of values to be applied indiscriminately, but one thing is sure, moral certainty does not define 21st century museum ethics. So are museums content in the 21st century with the implementation of their programmatic goals? In the 21st century, the demand for pluralism, more democracy and inclusion is strong, highlighting the shift of power to the public, to people who want to see themselves reflected in the collections and the exhibitions. And museums can contribute towards social inclusion at the individual, community, and societal levels. But that would mean a total renegotiation of power relations and the game of power in a more complex way than the new museology of the 70s proposed. This lecture paper, though, does not intend to advance a notion of professionalization. By examining museum ethics as social practice, it aims to highlight an under-theorized sphere of inquiry and argues that in the 21st century, it's not enough to rhetorically or even loosely maintain the project of democracy, but instead to try to implement it with all possible means and with all possible risks, even if this is a differentiated approach to utopia. So it is certain that art institutions have moral agency. How is this asserted, though? Janet Marsden has argued that there are three theoretical positions that should update current work in relation to museum ethics: social responsibility, radical transparency, and shared guardianship. All three strands might sound as self-evident, but are they? Social responsibility is not limited to audience development or more inclusive representations, but also refers to opening up new agendas, new research methodologies, new research questions and factors. The ethical, socially responsible museum of the 21st century recognizes identity of its staff and its public as hybrid and fluid, rather than simply boxes to be ticked. Recognizing identities means also recognizing differences and a different way of civic discourse, something that presumes risk, the risk of unpredictability, and of potential transformation of the institution itself. The contingent nature of the new museum ethics suggests not only that museums depend upon discursive practices with a diversity of stakeholders, but also upon innovative approaches to this engagement. Would we think that we really do allow communities to own museums? What is the role of staff members themselves? The new kind of public sphere that the social media has introduced suggests also a non-hierarchical engagement with the museum. Bernadette Lynch suggests reciprocity as an effective mode to nurture shared authority. This kind of reciprocity redefines the values of the core in favor of those of the margins. Radical transparency refers equally to decisions made about administration, communication, and interpretation, no less than decisions about knowledge production. The hows and whys of the various decision-making processes is not about airing the dirty laundry of individuals or institutions. Such airings can betray trust and do not advance the debate. It is neither about the rationalization of power nor about sharing all information equally, ignoring time-sensitive issues. Radical transparency not only describes, but also analyzes behavior and underlines its significance. It is a mode of communication that admits accountability. To exemplify it, in Martin's words, a transparent wall text might tell us that an artifact is of unknown provenance. A radically transparent wall text would additionally engage the ethical issues of exhibiting works of unknown provenance. The same goes for an array of broadly accessible communication tools such as museum web pages, providing strategic plans, annual reports, collection policies, staff and board directories, or technologies that facilitate visitor-generated content, exhibition or artists' projects that criticize the museum, open storage policies, etc. Analyzing decision-making means a lot more for the culture of transparency than simply justifying behavior and decisions. Finally, shared guardianship means equal opportunities for all concerned to gain and create new knowledge from and about the museum. Feminism, post-colonial theory, and digital heritage studies have all contributed to the construction of a more contingent and fluid relationship between objects and experiences in the museum. This anticipates a corresponding transition from a stance of possession to one of guardianship. In this frame, material culture is more a social process rather than a body of concrete things. In the same way, artists had been seen, as Claire Bishop noted since the 90s, as those who produced situations and discursive practices rather than objects. The deconstruction of the binary relationship between virtuality and authenticity is part of the same thinking. The notion more of a temporal caretaking in partnership with source communities comes to substitute the notion of cultural property. Collections management in that frame permits a totally different access to knowledge. Do all these sound as wishes, as something we should just hope for? Does practice meet theory easily? Here is a reaction reported by one museum in the aftermath of an experience of community collaboration in co-producing an exhibition. There was a feeling of weariness, of disappointment, of frustration from the community members and the museum staff. Two of them had left. One member of the community embarked on an almost fanatical, vitriolic series of complaints and criticisms that the museum had no real understanding or knowledge of the community, that it lacked commitment and experience, that it was misappropriating the funds, that it was not transparent in its dealings with the community, that it was unprofessional and exclusive, that it was only concerned with completing the project for its own aims and not for any benefit to the community. And finally, and most damning, that the museum encouraged, and I quote, subterfuge, distrust, and competition within the community. Typically, museum professionals meet such conflict with a cool, managerial, or academic response, concealing a fear of the public rather than rising up to and embracing this fear of public. Perhaps something more honest and human is all that is required in these interactions. At a debate at the Manchester Museum, a member of the local community said, "We are here to challenge, and I fear that others may not challenge us back. It's not for you to just listen to us being angry and just listen. The point is the dialogue. The point is that we could be totally wrong. I don't personally believe I'm wrong, but I'm willing to listen to somebody who totally disagrees with me." Would that suggest a conflict between theory and practice or between reality and aspirations? Here you can see an image uh, in a moment. It's provided by Marston, and it illustrates the tensions that I described now, and is also to salute the University of Glasgow, since the image comes from a performance of Anthony Schrag at the Gallery of Modern Art in Glasgow. But it gets more complicated. Nora Sternfeld, who draws on Laclau and Mouffe, among others, in the last chapter of her book, The Radical Democratic Museum, an essay called Why Exhibit at All, creates, an almost post-apocalyptic utopia. She projects ahead into the year 2030, imagining a political authoritarian fascist turn to the right, in which she and a collective of artists, activists, researchers, and dissidents will live in a museum that they have occupied and taken over. In this context, they have developed an exhibition about the representational struggles of the last years from 2013 to 2023 in museums, art academies, and other institutions that are critical of representation. And for this exhibition about practices of exhibiting, they gather snapshots from arts activism, funding programs, and work from artist collectives, and let us readers gain insight into the processes of writing and creating this exhibition. In this context, too, she is concerned with the question of whether the numerous anti-racist, feminist, and post-colonial struggles, which have problematized the history of violence, the dominance of certain cultures, the multiple exclusions and inequalities in museums, are or are not part of the capitalization of critique, and thus legitimize rather than challenge structures of power. The final question is of importance and not easy to answer. Can we exhibit conflict, activism, and negotiation without shutting them down? To sum up, the challenges presented by the inclusion agenda are in fact much more significant and the implications more fundamental and far-reaching. Deeper thinking on the concepts of social inclusion and exclusion will require museums and the profession and the sector as a whole to radically rethink their purposes and goals. So, is cultural democracy possible in a museum? Can we, as museum workers, embrace the contingencies of museum work and its ethics? Can we promote the shift in emphasis from product to process if that means to welcome conflicting views as a constructive contribution? And even if ethic codes do not resolve ethics issues, can we fight to promote an ethics of social change when seen as a matrix of other mechanisms? In relation to this inclusive, socially oriented ethical agenda of museums, the idea of justice as fairness, public reason, and the duty of civility introduced by John Rawls might be of use. Reasonable citizens, according to Rawls, want to live in a society in which they can cooperate with their fellow citizens on terms that are acceptable to all. They are willing to propose and abide by mutually acceptable rules, given the assurance that others will also do so. Each reasonable citizen has her own view about God and life, right and wrong, good and bad, her own comprehensive doctrine, as Rawls calls it. Reasonable citizens are tolerant, Rawls says, because they accept a certain explanation for the diversity of worldviews in their society. However, the challenge of legitimacy is not solved. No comprehensive doctrine can be accepted by all reasonable citizens, and so no comprehensive doctrine can serve as the basis for the legitimate use of coercive political power. Besides, who is the reasonable citizen? There is only one source of fundamental ideas that can serve as a focal point for all reasonable citizens of a liberal society. This is the society's public political culture, which Rawls says comprises the political institution of a constitutional regime and the public traditions of their interpretation, as well as historic texts and documents that are common knowledge. Although Rawls is not referring to museums, I consider them definitely as, broadly speaking, political institutions. Therefore, it would be interesting to try and apply his thought. The museum's public character would force us to think about the public values they advocate. The public values that citizens must be able to appeal to, according to Rawls, are the values of a political conception of justice, those related to the freedom and equality of citizens and to the fairness of the terms of social cooperation. Among such public values are the freedom of religious practice, the political equality of women and racial minorities, the efficiency of the economy, the preservation of a healthy environment, and the stability of the family. The museum professionals who exercise powers of public office would have a duty to constrain their decisions by public reason and should be able to justify their decisions by public standards of inquiry, by principles of reasoning and rules of evidence that all citizens could reasonably endorse. In an important proviso, Rawls adds that citizens may speak the language of their controversial comprehensive doctrines, even as public officials, and even on the most fundamental issues, so long as they show how these assertions support the public values that all share. The audience, from the other hand, is not bound by any duties of public reason. Neither are the artists, when, for example, they perform on stage or collaborate. However, the duty to be able to justify one's decisions with public reasons is a moral duty, not a legal duty. And that is how it enters my thinking about museum ethics. It is a duty of civility. All citizens always have their full legal rights to free expression, and overstepping the bounds of public reason is never in itself a crime. Rather, citizens, museums, professionals, audience, and artists, in our case, have a moral duty of mutual respect and civic friendship, not to justify their political and other decisions on fundamental issues by appeal to partisan values or controversial standards of reasoning that cannot be publicly redeemed. Considering art institutions as public institutions, Rawls' doctrine of public reason would be rather permissive concerning what professionals and audience may say and do within the bounds of civility in the museum space. Would we think that all this is too much to ask from our audiences? At first, let's ask it from museum professionals, in other words, from ourselves. To conclude, life and culture are constantly creating and testing new forms, the boundaries of which then erode. This is, says Zimmel, the tragedy of civilization. The struggle to maintain the core of one's individuality against an impersonal community and power structure is utterly utopian. And maybe this is a good definition of utopia, because fatally that political communities and art institutions also boast that they protect the integrity of the persons, while at the same time they soften it, not necessarily by the laws of the state, but by their internal ethical codes, whenever it threatens to exceed the permissible limits. The project of modernity, the demand for an irreconcilable and autonomous mind, remains almost mythical. But the community ultimately benefits from those who take the risk of standing up to it through the eyes of the assimilated other, the repatriated, or the foreigner. Can museum workers exist as such incompatible individuals and reasonable citizens at the same time, or will they dismantle the system of their institutions? Since museums are still considered as institutions that can be trusted, can museum workers train people into providing reasonable arguments about public values? Can the new moral philosophy in the institutional space of the arts become the vehicle for a beneficial parasite in the body of its slow-moving host? Can the claim of a social, cultural, and artistic emancipation, as well as the claim of civility, be expressed by the museums, their administrations, and the people who substantiate them? Or will it remain a utopia? An outlook to the future may entail that one does not merely aim at establishing other practices of representation, but is committed to think of them above all. Even if we cannot provide one conclusive answer to all questions asked above, if claims about the democratization of democracy and art may never be achieved, these claims must always be thought of and, if possible, be practiced. To what extent conflict and partiality, or consensus and individuality, will prevail will always be a matter that will rely on the soft power of each one of us, keeping in mind the main goal, to reinforce public reason. And to end, some days ago, I heard my 8-year-old son shouting enthusiastically to his friend while playing an online game, Utopia, Utopia, here it is. What is this? His friend asked. It's this level in the game, this ring, where I always win, he replied. So, can we win too, together? And how many of us can fit into this we? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Misirloglou. It was a very interesting perspective on the matter of utopia. And now I will